Thank you. I'm going to talk about a view that I call Teleo-Inferentialism, supposed to be some kind of new meta semantic theory that I want to put on the table in very rough outlines. I mean, very, very rough outlines. And the motivation for that came from me starting to be part of Yarda's project in naturalizing inferentialism. And before that, I didn't care that much about naturalism. So that motivated me to think about to what extent I am a naturalist, in particular a meta semantic naturalist. And here is what I came up with, thinking about to what extent I want to be a naturalist. So the view is going to combine normative inferentialism, which for me is basically Brandonian inferentialism, and teleosemantics, in particular teleosemantics in the spirit of Millikan. And I first want to talk a little bit about these views, then I'm going to talk a little bit about this new view that combines them, teleo-inferentialism, and then I want to apply it to Kripkensteinian worries about meaning skepticism as a test case. So before that, some warnings and some goals. So what I want to do is I want to put on the table a new meta-semantic theory, highlight some advantages it has over the two views from which it is built, and say something about Kripkenstein. I'm not going to go for any real comparison to rival meta-semantic theories because that's just way too big a project. And I will remain silent about most issues that get people worked up when they think about meta-semantics, and I will take on board a lot of Brandonian inferentialism with no questions asked. So if you are going to expect me to defend all of that, it's not going to happen. Okay, the two theories from which it's built. So first of all, this is going to be a meta-semantic. So that means that we're in the business of trying to explain in virtue of what it is that the meaningful items have the meanings that they do. And then the next thing is, well, what do I mean by meaningful items? What kind of content or meaning is involved? And I want to be neutral with respect to mental content versus linguistic content. I will just talk about content and contentful items, whether those are linguistic or mental. And in particular, the kind of thing I'm interested in is what I call cognitive role. And cognitive role is what allows us to theorize about rationality. So which kind of combinations of attitudes or speech acts are compatible or coherent, are rational, for which kinds of things one has reasons. These kinds of things are the things we want to theorize with this notion of content that is my target, cognitive role. The relation to semantic values in compositional semantics or to representation might be distant. I have no claims about that. And I will just assume that we can capture cognitive roles by inferential roles. That's where I just follow inferentialism. And then naturalism, I will assume that we want to have a naturalistic metasemantics, but I will also assume that evaluations of things as malfunctioning or defective are naturalistically respectable. Because I'm thinking biologists deal in these kinds of assessments all the time. So I'm thinking we can just freely appeal to them. Those are the basic assumptions. Now, the two views I want to combine. First is inferentialism a la Brandom, and the core tenets of inferentialism that I want to put on the table is first, we think of inferential roles as the thing that fixes content. That is basically trivial on my assumptions because it fixes cognitive roles by my assumptions, and that's the content I'm after. Second, these inferential roles are themselves fixed by norms, and these norms are social norms, norms of social practices for Brandom. And then these social norms cannot be explained by non-normative naturalistic terms, according to Brandom. I'll say a little bit more in a minute. The other view is Millikan's teleosemantics, and for Millikan, there are functions, devices, or whatever you have that has content has functions, or that produces items that have content has functions, and those functions are functions for mapping things in the environment, and this function of mapping is what fixes content. And then we can distinguish derived and underived biological functions, and the derived biological functions, those are typically, or the mapping functions are typically derived biological functions, but they derive from underived biological functions. And then these underived biological functions, they are fixed by evolutionary history, ultimately. Okay, so how do these views relate to one another? I think there's one salient commonality, and that's no accident because they're both kind of Salesian in spirit. They both think that there's something to the idea of meaning or content being normative, but they spell out this normativity in very different terms. And so they think of the source of normativity as being different. And second, they think of the type of content they're after as different. So I think we can represent this in this Venn diagram. There is the top red circle says that the primary content we're after is cognitive role. What I explained is cognitive role, and then everything outside that circle, I will just assume to be content as representation. And there's no other kind of content around because otherwise I need more circles, you know. And then there are two kinds of sources of norms. There are social sources of norms, so social norms, and there are biological norms as potential sources. And I think that Brandom sits here in the middle between so in the overlap between social norms and cognitive role content, meaning that he's shooting for an explanation of cognitive role in terms of purely social norms. I'm thinking that Millikan is sitting in the lower intersection because she's shooting for an account of representational content by combining social and biological norms. I think she's combining social and biological norms because she allows for learning and social practices to play a crucial role in having derived derived biological functions around that are ultimately resting on the underived ones. And my Teleo-Inferentialism is going to be similar to Millikan in that respect, but it's going to sit in the middle there. That's the view we're going for. All right, so problems. Why do we need a new account? Why aren't the old accounts good enough? And I'm not going to say why all other metasemantic theories are wrong. I'm just going to go for these two. And I'm just going to raise one problem for each because there are a ton of problems. I will ignore all the other problems that these views have. So one problem with inferentialism is that it's not naturalistically respectable, at least on many counts or on the eyes of many people. The social norms are explained, according to Brandom, in terms of assessments, but it is essential to these assessments that they themselves stand under norms and can be correct or incorrect. And so there is no bottom to this. As Bob says, it's norms all the way down. It's norms all the way down because the things you use in explaining the norms are these assessments or normative attitudes that are themselves governed by norms. And so there's no bottom there. And one reason why he thinks that is because he thinks there is no other solution to Kripkensteinian worries, because there is no purely dispositional view can handle Kripkensteinian worries. And de Vries, for example, spells this out. There are many people who complain about this. Here's de Vries complaining about him. Brandom emphasizes the rational intentional order, but says disappointingly little about its relation to the causal or natural order. Brandom sometimes wants to appeal to Price's distinction between subject and object naturalism, wants to say that he's a subject naturalist and not an object naturalist. I have worries about that, but I won't go into that. I will just assume that that doesn't work. So the problem, this problem at least, has to do with norm source. It has to do with thinking about the norms as purely social and social in a non-reducible way, right? So there's non-reducible normativity here, so you don't get a naturalistically respectable account of these norms. Teleosemantics also has a problem, and one problem that it has is that it can't easily account for sophisticated contents. Here's Neander saying as much. He says, I sympathize with the view that we might be unable to explain sophisticated forms of intentionality at present, as its most sophisticated forms might have ties to non-intentional nature that are too complicated and various to be comprehended, at least for now. The problem here is that for these theories, they typically want these mapping functions to reality. Now, these mapping functions must play a role in, for example, evolutionary fitness. But for them to play a role in evolutionary fitness or something like that in the selectional history, they must have some causal powers. Now, that doesn't work if the representanta the things that you represent don't have any causal powers. It's not clear how, representing them correctly or incorrectly can make any difference, because, if complex numbers have no causal powers, then representing them correctly or incorrectly shouldn't make any difference, because they don't show up in the causal history of any of your dispositions or whatever you do. So this is also, Peacock has stuff on that. It's an old complaint, right? And there have been answers, but at least Neander still thinks that that is one of the big problems. And the problem comes from content type, that thinking of the content type as in terms of a representation. If you don't think of content types in terms of representation, but for example, in terms of inferential role, you don't have that problem because it's not so hard to spell out the inferential role of, causally inert representanda. Complex numbers have a pretty clear inferential role. Just look at the math of complex numbers or things like that. So it's not hard to spell this out. So you might think that the right thing to do is to side with teleosemantics on the question of norm source, and to side with normative inferentialism on the issue of content type. And that's precisely what teleo-inferentialism is doing. So trying to solve both problems at once by taking one insight from each of these views. So the idea is that we side with inferentialism on content type, and we side with teleosemantics on the norm source. How is that going to work? So here is teleo-inferentialism in its barest outlines. It's the conjunction of these two claims. We have inferential role, and inferential role tells us that the content of items is determined by the inferential norms that govern the use of these items. That's basically just taking it straight over from Brandomian inferentialism or any other kind of inferentialism. It doesn't matter, if you like one of the other ones, Bogosian or Harman or something like that, that should still work pretty much straight out of the box. The other claim is the inferential norm claim, and that is the claim that the inferential norms that govern the use of an item are derived from broadly functional natural norms that govern exercises of characteristically human abilities. And that's, of course, something that Brandon wouldn't want to say. That's the teleosemantic bit here. So I'm not going to defend inferential role because, as I said at the start, I'm just taking over normative inferentialism, no questions asked. So here's the point where I don't ask any questions. The action will be at the second one. Inferential norm. That's what we're going to zoom in on. Maybe one word in defense of inferential role, just in my specific context. It's not so hard to defend this if you grant me the assumption that the content we are after is cognitive role. Then, these inferential roles seem to be tailor-made to capture cognitive roles. So even if they can't ultimately get you representational content or something like that, that's a further problem. If what you're interested in is the first cognitive role, that seems to be fine. All right, one crucial concept that I will use is the concept of a capacity, because I think that capacities, in my terminology, capacities are goodness-fixing potentialities inherent in their bearers. So there are people or other things that have potentialities, and potentialities come with standards of well-functioning or malfunctioning. So for example, some people might think that I have a capacity to drink 1 liter of water. That is not a capacity on my way of talking because it doesn't have standards of doing it well or badly. There's no such thing as drinking 1 liter of water well or badly. Maybe there's success and failure, but there isn't anything like doing it well or badly. On the other hand, my immune system has the ability, the capacity to kill antigens, and that capacity can be performed well or poorly, I think, because there's lots of things floating around in my body that it shouldn't kill, even though there are in some sense antigens. If you think about my digestive tract or something like that, the thing can malfunction in many different ways, in very specific ways. So there's something like doing it well or badly. And bike riding is another such example. I can ride a bike badly or well, and then of course I can crash and fail at all, but capacities come with these standards. And then inferential capacities are just special kinds of capacities. They are capacities for using items in reasoning. Now you might want to have a detailed account of how this goes, what this capacity of using a meaningful item in reasoning comes to. I will not give you that because this is a hugely controversial issue. I have views about what reasoning is. Some of those are in writing, but I don't want to unpack all of that. I just assume that we all agree that we can reason with meaningful items and that we have the capacity to do that, which means that we can do so well or poorly. So their goodness fixing, the capacity fixes what is good reasoning with an item. And probably that comes with the function of reasoning in some sense, right? Probably the standard of well-functioning or malfunctioning of a capacity like that comes with or is fixed by the standard of reasoning, the function of reasoning in general. Now, I want to black box that function. Some people think that it has to do with acquiring true beliefs, but some people think that that can't be right because it couldn't explain all the biases that we have in reasoning. There are tons of biases in our reasoning, and you would have to explain them if the design was to get you accurate beliefs. Some people think that that's okay. Maybe it was accurate in the circumstances in which it evolved. Gigerenzer has a view like that. So we can have lots of different views about what that is exactly, but I want to black box it and just say, as a naturalist, you should have a view about reasoning and its function, or else you should have some story about how we have that capacity reliably in humans if it doesn't have any such function. And I will just use that and say that whatever it is, it will probably fix a standard of well-functioning or poorly functioning. Now, if inferential capacities were innate, we would be done at this point, because we could say, look, reasoning with an item E in way W is correct if and only if doing so could be a non-defective exercise of a non-defective capacity to reason with E. Since these capacities come with these standards of evaluation, we know what this would be, even though we don't know in detail, and that would require empirical research, but the template is there. We just have to do the empirical research to fill out what this would come to. And then this norm would fix the inferential role of this item E. And given that the inferential role is fixing the cognitive role, and cognitive role is the kind of content we're shooting for, we would know what content that is. We would have an explanation of the content, and then we would evaluate, reasoning with an item E in pretty much the way in which we evaluate digesting food. It can be done well or poorly, and we just have the norms that are given to us by biology of doing so well or poorly at this point. Of course, that doesn't work because, I mean, maybe with the exception of Fodor, but I don't want to say that. We don't usually think that our cognitive grasp of concepts is innate, at least not to the fullest extent, right? There's some work we have to do in explaining how we have the particular concepts we have. For example, I don't think that the concept of democracy is innate. So the capacity to reason with democracy, by the way, concept possession for me is this possessing the capacity to reason with the thing, right? So possessing the capacity to reason with the thing, that is not innate for democracy, so we have to explain that. We must explain how there is a capacity like that, and that means we have to explain how there are norms for the exercises of that capacity. How are we going to do that? We're going to turn to Millikan. I think Millikan gives us a hint how we can do that, but she does it, of course, for representation. How does she do that for representation? How does she bring in the social, as it were? Here's what she says in a 2000 piece. She says, in the case of innate abilities, no matter what dispositions a mechanism happens to have, what determines its abilities, I use capacities because abilities is often used in the literature to mean something that involves intentional action. I don't think she means it. I definitely don't mean it. So I use capacity, or she uses ability. What determines its abilities is what it was selected for doing. In the case of learned abilities, that's what we're interested in, right? The learned abilities. What natural selection selected for was the ability to learn in a certain way. It's selected for mechanisms that became tuned through interaction with the environment to do things of useful kinds. For an organism to know how to do A as the result of learning is for it to possess an intact mechanism that is biologically designed to be tuned to do things like A, and that has been tuned to do A as designed. That is, it became tuned in the same manner, following the same principles as its successful ancestors when they were learning to do similar kinds of things. Now, can we just take that over? And I think we pretty much can. We just now not have to think about these mapping functions that Millikan is ultimately after. We have to think about our inferential capacities, right? But you know, the idea would be we have an innate capacity to learn inferential capacities. That innate capacity has its norms of evaluation by nature, whatever that exactly comes to. And then we can explain the norms for particular inferential capacities, like the capacity to reason with democracy or with complex numbers or things like that, from this innate capacity to learn inferential capacities. So we will say that the norms internal to particular inferential capacities are explained by the norms internal to the innate capacity to learn inferential capacities. And to do that, we will say that an inferential capacity is defective if and only if it could not be the product of a non-defective exercise of the innate capacity to learn inferential capacities given the learning environment, giving the learning opportunities. So the idea is you have an innate capacity to learn inferential capacities, and you may have possessed that capacity in a defective way or in a well-functioning way. If you possess that in a well-functioning way and you exercise it in a well-functioning way upon being put in a certain learning environment, then you will acquire a non-defective capacity to reason that was taught to you in that learning process, right? However, if you exercise your capacity in a defective way, then you might end up with a defective understanding of the concept, which means that you have a defective capacity to reason with the concept, like democracy or complex number, because you have not learned it properly. You have not learned it properly because you have not exercised your capacity to learn the inferential capacity successfully. So our social norms then determine the norms that are given to us in our learning environments, right? Your teacher tells you something about how to reason with complex numbers, and that might be a matter of social norms in the sense that, you know, the teacher knows how to reason with complex numbers because she learned how to reason with complex numbers from other people who knew how to reason with complex numbers. So there is a practice of us reasoning with complex numbers, and you have been initiated into this practice by your teacher telling you how to reason with complex numbers. You know, they come in complex conjugates and all that kind of thing. And then you acquire this ability. Of course, which ability you acquire depends on which ability you're taught, which depends on which practice is prevalent among the teachers around you. Okay, now let's take that theory out for a test drive on Kripkenstein. How does that work with Kripkenstein? So just to set up, I hope you're all bored by this. I will nevertheless give you a very quick run through. So the question that Kripkenstein asks is, in virtue of what did I mean in the past? Plus, so addition by plus, rather than quaddition, where quaddition is defined as agreeing with plus up to 57 and is 5 otherwise, and we assume that I never encountered, or maybe no one ever encountered, an addition greater than 57. Of course, that's just for convenience. We know that there is such a number, so let's just let it be 57 to have a nice little number to deal with. Dispositionalists say that it's in virtue of my dispositions that I meant addition by plus, and that I still currently mean addition by plus under the right circumstances, right? I'm disposed to do something under the right circumstances. I'm disposed to add under the right circumstances. Kripke says that that can't be right for 3 reasons. The first is that dispositions are finite, but contents are infinite. You know, the addition function is infinite, but whatever your dispositions are, they are finite regarding addition. Second, We have a disposition to make mistakes. We might even have a disposition to make systematic mistakes, and you still mean plus by plus, addition by plus, even if you have these mistaken dispositions. And meaning is normative, and Kripke thinks that that's the root of the problem. Meaning is normative. In some sense, it tells you what to do next in the next case, but your dispositions don't. How does Teleo-Inferentialism manage the problem? First, the answer to why I meant, in virtue of what I meant addition by plus, is that I meant addition in virtue of the fact that my use of plus was and is governed, sorry, typo, by the inferential norms for addition. And we can spell that out. It's some kind of inferential rule version of the piano axioms, if you care to do so. So those are supposed to be the norms governing your use, and according to inferentialism, then that's the content, that fixes the content. My inferential use of plus, uses of plus are governed by those rules for addition because they are acts of a capacity to reason with expressions for addition, right? Like the capacity I exercise when I add is a capacity to add. And that capacity comes with its internal standards, and those internal standards are the standards given by these inferential norms. Now, how is it that what I exercise is a capacity for addition rather than quaddition? My capacity to reason with plus is a capacity to reason with addition rather than quaddition, because a non-defective human capacity to learn reasoning capacities would yield a capacity to reason with addition given my learning opportunities. You know, my teachers in primary school could have taught me quaddition, but they would have to have put me in a very different learning environment for me to pick up quaddition. What they in fact put me in is a learning environment that was such that a non-defective human being, in particular a human being with a non-defective capacity to learn inferential capacities, the rules that such a human being picked up from the learning environment that I encountered in primary school, give or take, you know, none of these people is perfect. They all screw up somewhere along the way, which is part explains why I screw up. I don't want to blame them. It's also because I screw up just by myself. But you know, we're all human. We screw up left, right, and center. But the kind of environment I encountered in primary school is the kind of environment where normal humans, meaning non-defective humans, which are statistically not normal, but you know, they are normal in the biological sense of normal, learn addition rather than quaddition. And that doesn't run into any of the problems that Kripke raised for dispositionalism, because the norms are infinite. You know, the norms internal to capacity are infinite. That is actually already the case with the norms governing your digestive system. They are infinite in a certain way. Then these norms allow for mistakes. There is a right and wrong here that has to do with the defective and non-defective exercise of these capacities. And they are trivially normative, right? I built this in at the ground level. That was what we were shooting for. Now, there are two worries you might have. There are actually much more, but you know, I'm limited for time, so I will just talk about a couple of worries you might have. So one worry is, how do you know that the capacity that results from a non-defective exercise of your learning capacities is a capacity for addition? You know, maybe we just all got it wrong. Maybe we massively, systematically are malfunctioning and getting it wrong. Really, we all should have learned quaddition. How do I know? And my answer is, I don't. But you see, to answer the meaning skeptic, it is enough that there's a fact of the matter there. I actually think it's pretty plausible that it's addition that we should be learning, but if you happen to disagree, fine. What the meaning skeptic wanted to say is that there is no fact of the matter, and that has been ruled out no matter what you think I might be mistaken about. Then next worry, even if the most ideal exercise of our learning capacities cannot yield a capacity that fixes the whole of addition, you might think, no, even if I exercised my capacity to learn addition in a perfect way, I would still be limited by my human nature, because you know, I still can't add these gigantic numbers, because you know, I wouldn't even be, my lifetime wouldn't be long enough to say them or to process them or whatever. My answer is that my capacity to read aloud has the same limitations, because you know, there are books. I mean, maybe they don't exist, but yeah, I guess you could easily make them up. that no human being can read aloud because they're just too long. We would die before we get to the end of the book. Nevertheless, my capacity to read aloud sets a standard, a normative standard for what it means to read the book correctly or incorrectly aloud. For example, I'm dyslexic, I make tons of mistakes. And I would make tons of mistakes in the infinite book. It's not as if the norms wouldn't apply to the infinite book. Even at the start, I would make mistakes. And you can say that I would have made mistakes, you know, have disposition to make mistakes all the way up. Okay, so in general, because there are these dispositions, there are norms internal to them, they include all the infinite many cases. And then you might wonder, well, but look, what about a Martian? With different learning capacities, with a disposition to reason exactly as I'm reasoning. It's the same disposition, maybe even the same material basis of that disposition, right? The same categorical basis of my disposition in the Martian. It's just that the Martian has a different nature. And so what the Martian should have learned from primary school was quaddition. Even though maybe the Martian school, it looks exactly like my school, but you know, what the Martians pick up there is quaddition, and I pick up addition because how the Martians work. And then you might think, but surely if the Martian has the same inferential dispositions, the Martian must mean the same thing. And at that point, I'm just going to dig in my heels and say, no, the Martian, even if the Martian has the ability, has the disposition to add, if non-defective Martian capacities to learn inferential capacities would have led to a capacity for quaddition rather than addition, then the Martian is just mistaken when the Martian is adding. The Martian should be quadding, using quaddition, whatever the right word is for quaddition. So we mean different things. The Martian and I mean different things. The Martian means quaddition and I mean addition, even if we agree completely in our dispositions, including their categorical basis. All right, let's wrap up. So why and how do we give and ask for reasons? I'm not sure that I have any answer to that. Maybe a little bit to the how. Anyway, what Teleo-Inferentialism would say about it is that our ability to learn to give and ask for reasons, if that is the inferential ability, as I say, I would stay neutral on that. Maybe you think about the inferential ability as purely psychological, but you know, if we go along with the theme of the conference, then I think we can plausibly think that that is the inferential capacity, and that is innate. So we have an innate capacity to learn to give and ask for reasons. And this capacity to learn it has broadly biological standards of well-functioning and malfunctioning. How this ability then manifests or capacity manifests depends on the social practices around us in which the capacity is acquired. Because as in Millikan, that fixes what the particular norms are, right? The derived norms are. To sum up what I want to say, the view I want to put on the table is Teleo-Inferentialism, which says we have an innate capacity to learn how to reason with expressions that people around us use, you know, that we are taught how to reason with. The correct use of these expressions is the use that results from a non-defective exercise of the ability to learn how to use them. And that exercise is innate, and its norms are innate. The expressions have their meaning in virtue of how they are used correctly. So the norms governing the capacity to use the particular inferential capacities, which are not innate, but learned. That's it. Thank you.
So, Jeremy?
Thank you. That was super interesting. I wonder though if at the end you succeed in being naturalistic, and I guess my question centers around something you have from the last slide of section 2, where you say that an inference is bad if and only if it could not be the product of a non-defective exercise of inferential capacities. But it seems on top of that, like you want to help yourself to an additional notion of error that's not actually tied to this definition. You know, because I'm thinking in terms of you know, imagine that, you know, because it seems like there could be wrong inferences, because we care about materially valid inferences that are the exercises of perfectly good inferential capacities. You know, to give an extreme case, if someone is raised in an insular community of white supremacists and they, you know, habitually form the inference, you know, X is non-white, therefore X is not a person, that's not a failure of their learning capacities. That's a failure of their environment. But, you know, just to take less extreme cases, you know, all the time, you know, maybe I, you know, learn from someone who I reasonably took to be an authority that, you know, platypuses are amphibians or something. And that's just a wrong inference, but that's not a failure of my learning capacity. And you know, you yourself said that, you know, I could have, I could have some, you know, capacity that is, you know, the exercise of a properly functioning, you know, learning capacity like mathematics, but then I could make a mistake. So it seems like in addition to this definition of a proper inference, you also want a notion of mistake. So you want this additional normative notion that doesn't seem tied to this naturalistic definition you've given here. So where does this additional notion of mistake or error, this additional normative notion come in, and how is that naturalistic?
So I'm hoping to get by without that. Maybe I can't, but that is at least the ambition. So maybe I can say two things. There is also some way in which I might be able to get in some more representational mistaken notion in at the ground floor. If I, you know, given that the problem with teleosemantics seems to be about the sophisticated concepts, I can maybe get the unsophisticated concept and some notion of representational error back there, and then filter that up to the more complex ones. But let's just be honest in the sense that I want to say, no, really no representational or other kind of notion of error, even at the ground floor. Even though I just wanted to say that in principle, I could try to include some of that. But let's just try to be as extreme as I can. Then I would say, well, you know, with the platypus example, there are two scenarios. One scenario is where you have no countervening evidence, and so the rationality and good, you know, non-defective exercise of your rational capacities would actually lead you to adopt that inferential practice, to infer from it's a platypus to, what was it again? It's an amphibian, right? Which you take to be correct. I think at that point I can say, no, you know, you are importing the representational content here. If we stick with cognitive role, then what we should say is that you mean something non-standard by amphibian or by platypus at this point, which is rational for you to do. You have grasped some meaning. It's not the standard meaning. It was rational for you to grasp that meaning given your learning opportunities. But that's why you have a non-standard meaning for platypus right now. So it's a good inference, yes. That is one option. Or one scenario. If you spell out the scenario in such a way that there really is no cognitive problem here, then I would say that's the right option. At least if we're thinking about cognitive role, it's a good inference in the sense of cognitive role. Now, once we, you know, build up to the level of representation, then we might say, well, it's not truth preserving, and there's a problem with that. But we will have to go all the way, you know, in terms of making it explicit all the way to chapter 8 at the very end to get to the representational content. So we start out with this notion where it's a good inference, and then maybe later on we will get the notion on which it's a bad inference as well, in a different sense. But that's for cognitive role, yeah, that's what it's like. The other option is, of course, or the other scenario, if you spell it out in such a way that you actually have evidence that a platypus is a mammal. I recently looked that up. You know what the defining feature of a mammal is? Hair. We have all hair, right? You wouldn't think that, but necessary and sufficient if you have hair, right? So maybe you know that and you think, platypus, that thing looks hairy, you know? But then you think, but the guy says it's but in that case, you actually have countervening evidence. And maybe at that point, it isn't rational to just, you know, fall over immediately with whatever the authority tells you. And then you might be making a mistake because now you haven't exercised your ability to learn inferential capacities in the right way. Now, which one it is, that's of course difficult to say in the particular case. How much evidence did you have beforehand and so forth and so forth? I don't know that, but you know, those are the two scenarios that are in the cards from if I want to stick to my guns as firmly as I can.
Jarle?
I have 2 questions. First one, You have shown the graph with 3 overlapping circles, and there was the overlap between biological and social norms. Can you say a little bit more about the intersections? For example, to give an example of a norm which is biological and social, and perhaps by contrast, a norm which is not biological but social. So that's first.
Yeah. Okay. So of course, there will be theories where not all areas of the Venn diagram are non-empty, right? So according to some theories, there are no norms of a certain kind. But for the purely biological, it's what I use the digestive system for, right? So you can digest well or poorly, or the heart can pump blood well or poorly, purely biological. And I'm assuming that the capacity to learn inferential capacities has norms of that kind, broadly speaking. Then there are the ones that are mixed, and those are the ones that what Millikan would call derived functions. So that is the function that in the social case, right, where you need social learning in her case, to represent something. So she's thinking that there are systems in us to represent certain things, but what they are supposed to represent depends on the learning history that you have. You know, people teach other people what is represented by a certain term. And for me, the corresponding thing would be the norms, you know, to use the word democracy or complex number in an inference, which I think it is fixed by the social norm in conjunction with the biological norm, because the social norm is the practice around me, how complex number and democracy are used. And then it comes together with my innate norm of learning inferential capacities to fixes the norms for me to use the term. So that's in the overlapping area. And then in the purely social area, there would be the things that I think Bob is thinking about when he is talking about the norms. So there would be some norms that is completely constituted by taking each other to be entitled or committed to certain things without this having any tie to biological well-functioning or malfunctioning. But being merely, our biology is merely a causal necessary condition for us to get us to, you know, give and ask for reasons, but doesn't play any role beyond that.
So may I ask one more question?
We're doing this on your dime, so I think you can.
So you talk about the capacity to handle expression of addition or something like that. So what's an expression for addition? What is it?
Oh, so of course, there are certain expressions that we use for addition, like plus and like the written plus and things like that. And then for me, an addition, a symbol for addition is anything that is used, whose use is governed by the norms for addition. You know, and I let them be the piano axioms. But of course, if you have other views about what the correct norms for addition are, if you want to spell them out in different ways, fine with me. But some set like that.
But wasn't then what you articulated as the principles kind of tautological? Because you said something to the effect that norms for addition are those which we use to handle the expression for addition or something like that. Isn't this tautology then?
If you ask me, in virtue of what does, when I write the plus sign or the cross, but in virtue of what do I mean addition by that? The first answer is because my use is governed by those norms. And that's what makes it a sign for addition. And then if you ask me, well, but why is that? Why is the thing governed, my use of this thing governed by those norms? Then I tell you, well, I learned how to use this sign in primary school. And given my human nature, together with the experiences I had in primary school, fixes those norms. Now, those norms could have been other ones, right? If I had a really bad primary school teacher, then those norms would be other ones. And then my symbol plus wouldn't be a symbol for addition. Now, of course, I can formulate this in a way in which it sounds tautologically. I agree with that, that it sounds, well, why do our symbol for addition is a symbol for addition. And then I say, well, because it's governed by this, that sounds tautologically, but I don't think it is at the end of the day. I think if I can, could have been different. And maybe as a matter of fact, for one of us, the norms aren't the piano norms, right? Because we had really bad teachers. I mean, I hope no one is here like that. Maybe I'm the only one who can't add properly, but and not because I'm just malfunctioning right now, but in the sense that I was malfunctioning, so badly back then that I didn't even pick up that capacity. And given that this is possible, I don't see how it could be tautological, because it seems to me that there's a genuine possibility here that it might be a different capacity.
Okay, we've reached the end of our session, so let's thank Ulf.
Thank you. Thanks for the comments.
And we will break for lunch. We'll start again at 2:30 Central European Time.
Welcome to the first of the